How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another video. I'm going to show you how to make a audio spectrum like the one I have right here. Now, at a first glance, it might look a bit complicated to make one of these, but it is actually quite simple to do inside After Effects. And as we go through it, I do want to make sure that I show it in a way so that you can modify it in any sort of shape or color or, whatever purpose you might have for making this. I want to make sure that you learn from it and don't just copy paste and then you don't know how to make adjustments to it. Now, the song that I'm going to be using in my example here is going to be a song that I do have a license for. In your case, just go ahead and find any type of song that you might have on your computer. Or if you don't have any songs on your computer, you can actually go to YouTube Studio, which is the dashboard you have when you have a YouTube account. You can go into YouTube Studio. And in here, there is a tab you can click, and then YouTube does actually have a library of royalty-free music that you can use completely royalty-free. And the second thing that we don't really need to have, but I think is a nice thing to have to just sort of add an extra effect to our little demo that we're building here, is a background image. From here, I do want to mention that if you at some point want to skip ahead in the video, I do have timestamps in the description, which will also show up inside the timeline underneath the YouTube video. So you can very quickly find what particular part you want to learn how to do. So if you want to skip the part where we animate the background image and you want to jump straight to the audio spectrum, just go ahead and skip forward a little bit. Like I said, this is not really part of the actual tutorial on how to build this audio spectrum, but if you do want to have a background image that does look kind of cool behind the graphics that we're going to be making here, it is kind of nice to have a background image moving or something. So I found one here. This is one that I found off another place where they provide royalty-free images, and I will go ahead and leave a link for that website in the description if you do want to check it out. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and make a new composition. So I'm going to right click inside my project window, say new composition. In here, I'm just going to give it some kind of name like audio spectrum. Now, if you're wondering, the reason I'm calling it audio spectrum is because that's the name of the effect that we're going to be using. So just to give it some kind of name. Now, make sure that you do actually have a preset selected that could be, for example, the HD TV 1080 25 frames per second. Just so we have a normal aspect ratio going on. On the frame rate, you could select 30, but since we're doing motion graphics, I would recommend just typing in 60 so we have 60 frames per second. And then we just need to make sure that we select a duration that will fit the song that we're trying to make here. So I'm going to go ahead and select 5 minutes because I know that my song at least is not going to be 5 minutes long, so it's better to have it longer than too short. Background color, you can just choose anything. I just chose a dark gray color, and then we're going to click OK. So from here, I'm going to drag my image down so we have it inside the composition. I'm going to click S so we can scale it, and I'm just going to scale it up just a little bit since we can have some wiggle space. Then I'm also going to be dragging down the audio or the song that we chose inside the timeline. Now you can always adjust the audio levels in case you think your song might be a bit too loud. So I'm just going to open it up here, go on audio levels, and say -4, just so I don't blast off my ears as soon as I start playing this song. I'm going to close it again. And now you're going to notice that the song has a certain length. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the top layer. I'm going to drag it from the right side here to cut it down so we don't have the image going all the way to the 5 minutes. I'm going to hold down Shift on my keyboard, which will lock it in place with the other layer that we have here. As you can see, it sort of ticks in there and locks in. Then I'm going to do the same thing with the composition length. So I'm going to take it here. I'm going to drag it over, hold down Shift. This will make sure that when you export the song, it only goes till the end here, which is the end of the song, and then it just stops there. So it doesn't export a whole bunch of minutes that doesn't have anything on it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate the image in a very fast way. So I'm just going to click the image layer, going to click P for position, and then I want to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard and click the little stopwatch that we have next to position here. That is going to open up so we can actually start adding in code if we want to do something specific with the position. So I'm going to type wiggle. And as you can see, if I do type W, it will automatically have wiggle here as an option. So I'm just going to click it. Now what wiggle is going to do is that it's going to adjust the position numbers a certain number of times a second. So we need two parameters inside the parentheses here. We need to add how many times a second, and then we need to add how much do we want it to change. So in this case here, I want to say maybe 2 times a second, comma. And then I want to say, I want to change it by 10. And again, you can always play around with this. If you want to have a much more violent effect, then you might want to do it 10 times a second with a 20 in difference or something. You can play around with this. I think this number here is quite good. I'm going to click away from it. And if I were to play it, you can see that we have a wiggle effect going on. Now the last thing I want to do to the image is I want to add an effect to it because I want to blur it. So I'm going to write blur inside the effects panel over here. And I want to choose the one called Gaussian blur. Let's make sure we don't choose the legacy version. Let's make sure we choose the proper one. Drag it onto your layer. And then you want to go to your effects panel, which in my case is right here next to the timeline. But in your case, it's most likely up here next to the project window, just so you don't get confused by the fact that mine is down here. I'm going to add the blurriness to, let's say 100. Just so we have something like this going on. And as you can see, we have some blurriness going on. And that's basically all I want to do as my background, just so we have something going on behind the motion graphics we're going to create together. Now I'm just going to go ahead and close off my layers here, just so we don't have a bunch of drop downs. I'm going to highlight both of them. And I'm just going to go ahead and change the color of the tag here, just so we have some sort of organization. So I'm going to make this one, let's say blue. Just so we know that these might be like the background elements, like the song and the background image. So now what I want to do is I want to make the first example that I showed you, which is the circle audio spectrum that had like the bars going out from the side all the way around the circle. And the way you make that is, first of all, you're going to create a empty solid layer. So we're going to say new, solid. And then we're just going to go and pick some kind of name for it. It could be circle spectrum or something. Make sure you have the same settings as I do. And the background color doesn't really matter, but I just set mine to dark gray. I'm going to click OK. And then you'll notice we have this big black square. And this is where our audio spectrum tutorial really starts. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the effects and presets. I'm going to search for audio, which will have the audio spectrum popping up. So I'm going to take that, drag it onto my layer here. And then you'll notice we already have a spectrum going on. If we were to play the music, you can see that nothing is happening. And that's because we need to go into the audio spectrum effects. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we choose the proper audio layer. So right now you can see we have a audio layer property. And then I'm going to select the song that we have playing. Once we do that and play the song again, you can see that we do actually have something going on, which is kind of cool. Now, of course, this doesn't really look that awesome in the same sense as the small demo that I showed you at the beginning, but this is already starting to take shape into kind of what we want to have. I think a lot of people think that the hardest part about this is adding a spectrum that actually reacts to the music, but it's actually not. It might actually be the easiest part here. So just to kind of, everything is fine. What you would think is the hardest part is actually over. Now, before we start doing any sort of other changes to this, because we will actually be doing some pretty cool stuff with it, I just want to show you what some of these different properties down here inside the effects panel actually do. So as you can see right now, we have a certain length for the audio spectrum. If I were to go down to the start point and the end point, you can actually see that we can change the starting point and we can change the endpoint. We can do different things to this spectrum that we have here. But we're not really going to be messing with this because I want to show you how to change this in a much cooler way. And what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make sure that I have my layer selected, and then I'm going to make a mask. And the mask is going to be in the shape that I want the audio spectrum to be. So in this case here, I'm going to go up to my toolbar at the top here. I'm going to hold it down on the rectangle tool, select the ellipse, and then I'm going to go down to the composition. I'm going to drag it out and hold down shift at the same time so we don't get all this curvy stuff going on. There we go. After creating it, you can see that we now have a mask inside the layer. Now I just want to center this really quickly, so I'm going to choose the selection tool. I'm just going to right click it, go to transform, and first I want to make sure that we center the anchor point, just in case we need to do that. Then I want to right click again, transform, then I want to center in view. And now you can see everything is completely centered here. However, you will also notice that right now the audio spectrum is actually just getting masked, which is what a masking tool does. But what we can actually do is we can go down inside our layer, and next to the mask, I don't want the mask to add or subtract or do any sort of masking here. I just want to have it set to none. So now we can see the full spectrum going here. This means that our masking layer right now is actually not a mask. It's just a path essentially that's curved around into a circle. So what we can do now is we can go inside the layer, inside the effects panel, and tell it to add a path to the audio spectrum. So inside where we have the path property here, I'm just going to select mask 1. And as you can see, if I were to play it, we now have the audio spectrum going around the mask. And all of a sudden, this audio layer start point and end point is not something that will actually change anything. It becomes completely obsolete because instead we created our own path for it. And I just want to point out, you can use any kind of shape for any sort of type of audio spectrum. If you want to make a square, if you want to make a polygon, if you want to make a star, or if you want to take the pen tool here and draw something customized, you can do that as well. You just need to make sure you go into the path down here and add it as your path inside the audio spectrum effect. So now what we want to do is we want to make some changes to this audio spectrum, because right now, I mean, it looks cool, but it's not quite the way we want it to be. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go inside the effects panel. I'm going to make some changes to the audio spectrum to just sort of customize it in a much cooler way. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the end frequency. And essentially what we're going to do here is we're just going to limit the frequencies that we want to pick up when it comes to this little wheel that we have going on here. So I'm just going to limit from 2000 down to 300 because this will look a lot better. So we're to play it now. You can see we have something a lot better looking. I'm also going to change the frequency bands, which just to show you what it does, if I were to select a random part here, if I were to change this one, you can see that we're changing the number of bars that we have inside our frequency meter. So I want to have a very tight looking one, I just change it up, to a higher number. If I want to have fewer, I just narrow it down a little bit. In my case here, I'm just going to select 100. The next thing I'm going to change is going to be the thickness of the bars. So I'm just going to go ahead and change it here. So I'm going to change it from 3. I'm going to add it up, and as you can see, it starts getting thicker and thicker and thicker. In my example here, I'm just going to make it into something like, let's say 7 for now. I'm also going to change the softness down here, which if I were to turn it up, you can see actually kind of blurs the outline. So I just want to turn that all the way down to 0, so we get a very sharp looking spectrum going on. And last but not least, we don't want to have a pink wheel going, or maybe you want to in your example, but in my example here, I'm just going to change it to white. So I'm going to say the inside color is going to be white, which is going to change the inside of the spectrum. And then you can change the outside, which is going to change the outside of the spectrum. So as you can see, the outline of the spectrum bars actually changed to something else. You could kind of mix it up to maybe give it a neon colored effect. But in my example here, like I said, we're just going to change it to white. And now you might think this is a really cool way to do it. But I do think that we only need to have the bars on the outside and not on the inside, because maybe I want to have the song title. I might have some other information inside the circle. I'm going to scroll down inside the effects panel, and I'm going to go down to where it says side options. And here you can select whether or not you want to just have side A, which is going to be the inside, or side B, which is going to be the outside. Or if you want to have both, you just select A and B. So in my example, I just want to select side B. If I were to play this, you can see we have something that looks closer to the end goal we're trying to achieve here. Now, there is a few more properties inside the audio spectrum effect that I do want to talk about, but we're not going to do with this example here because it's much easier to see what exactly they do when we do have a straight line audio spectrum instead of a circle. So I'll show that in just a second. But before we move on to the next example, I do want to show another effect I thought was really cool, which is something I saw from another YouTuber, which is to add a circle inside our circle here that actually counts down how much of the song that's left to play. So what I'll do is I'll go inside our layer called Circle Spectrum. I'll go down to the mask, click it, click Control D on my keyboard or Command D if you're on Mac, which is going to duplicate it. And I'm just going to right click the first mask and rename it to Audio Spectrum. And then I'm going to rename the second mask to Timer, because this is going to be the timer that counts down how much of the song is left. Then with the selection tool, I'm just going to double click one of the anchor points. As you can see, we can now transform it. So I'm just going to click one of the corners, drag it down, but I want to make sure I hold down Shift and Alt and Control. And I'm just going to adjust it so that it looks exactly the way that I want it to. So just around maybe here. If I were to click away from it, just to kind of show what's going on, you can see that nothing really happened. We reshaped this mask layer, but we didn't really do anything with it just yet. And that's because right now, the audio spectrum effect that we added is only affected by the audio spectrum mask that we added in here. So if I want to change something with the timer mask, I do need to add a second effect to change that particular one. So to do that, I'm going to go up inside my effects and presets. I'm going to search for stroke, and I'm going to drag that onto my layer. Inside my effects controls, I'm just going to scroll down so we can see it. And then I want to make sure I select the timer mask inside the path property that we have here. Then I'm going to adjust the brush size, so we can actually resize that up if we want to, just to kind of see what's going on. We can make it a really thick one, or we can make a kind of thin, skinny one here. And now what I want to do is I want to go inside my timeline, go all the way back to the start. I want to go over to the effects panel, and I want to change the end so that right now it's at 100% at the very beginning of my timeline. So I'm just going to click the stopwatch right next to end. And then I'm going to take my timeline, move it all the way to the last frame. And if you hold down Shift, it will actually lock itself to the last frame. And then I want to go back to my effects panel and change end to 0. This means that right now, if you were to take your timeline and move it, you can actually see that the circle is moving depending on where on the timeline I'm currently at. So if I were to play this, you can see it's actually diminishing depending on where inside the song we are. And then the last thing you can do is you can add in some text if you want to have the name of the song inside the circle. And now just really quickly how you do that, because I know some people are new at After Effects, you just right click inside your composition, you say new text, and then you write something. And then inside the right side of your screen, you can see you can change the characters and you can change the paragraph. You want to have it centered or aligned to the right or the left. You can do that over here. And just to kind of make something, I just wrote it in here. And now we basically have a circle that's actually doing something to the music, which is kind of cool. Now in the next example, we're going to make a straight line that has bars going up and down, where the top version is not going to have bars, but it's going to have these little analog dots that are moving up and down, which is kind of a different cool effect that you could have for your audio meter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing as the last example. I'm going to right click, create a new solid. And the settings should be roughly the same. We're just going to rename it here to Line Spectrum. And again, we're just going to go into the effects and presets, add audio, and just take the audio spectrum, drag it into our solid layer. And then I want to draw a mask. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the pen tool for this. Make sure that you do have the layer selected. I'm going to click, hold down Shift, and click further to the right. Now, when you hold down Shift, it will make a straight line instead of it being one pixel off, which makes it look kind of weird. And with the layer selected, we're going to go into the effects panel and we're going to go ahead and select the new mask, which is mask 1. I also want to change the audio layer, so we actually have it set to the song layer that we added into our composition. And now I can see we have a line going on instead. Let's actually go and remove the graphic that we created in the last example. So I'm just going to take my selection tool. I'm going to highlight my layer 2 and 3, which is the ones that we created in the previous example. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag them over so we don't have them in the way. I'm also going to go ahead and change the color tag for my new layer, because this is example number 2, so it shouldn't be red, just so we know which one is which inside our timeline. Now I'm going to take my line spectrum that we just created, and I'm going to drag it over to the right. And inside the effects panel, we're just going to make all the same changes as the previous example to just kind of show you how we can alter this to make it fit more of a line spectrum instead of a circle. So the end frequency is going to be 300. The frequency bands is going to be 100. The thickness is going to be, I think we chose 6 or maybe 7. And the softness is going to be 0. I'm going to change the colors so they're white. And then I don't want it to have bars going out on both sides. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell it to select side B. But as you can see, this isn't really the right settings for this particular example. It might be perfect for the circle example, but not for this one. So what I'm kind of noticing here, if I zoom in, is that we have way too many bars going on. So I'm going to limit that by going into the frequency bands. I'm just going to drag it down a little bit. I think around 50 might be good. If I were to scroll out, you can see it looks a lot better. But now I wanted to have some different colors going on, because what do we do if I don't just want to have a white colored spectrum that's moving around? What you can do is you can change the inside color by choosing the inside color drop down. I know we just changed this one to white, but that was just to revert the settings back to what we did in the previous example, if you followed that example. And I'm gonna go ahead and go up to red and just choose a red inside color. I'm gonna click OK. I'm gonna choose the outside color. I'm just going to choose a slightly, let's say a slightly darker version of it, which is down here. And again, you can just select any kind of color you might prefer to have. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to hue interpolation, which is going to add in more different colors that are close to this particular color that we picked here. So if we were to take the wheel and just drag it over a little bit, you'll see, oh, we start to get some yellow. If I keep turning it, we're going to start getting green. If I keep turning it, we're going to start seeing some blue. It's going to start adding in the different colors that we have in the color wheel, but it's going to take the one that's closest to the color that we picked first. In my example here, let's just go ahead and take, so we have just a little bit of orange and a little bit of yellow going on. And I think that looks really good. Now there's two more properties down here that I want to show you. One is called dynamic hue phase and one is called color symmetry. Now the one called dynamic hue phase is basically going to phase into different hue colors that we're adding in, depending on how the spectrums are moving. So if you want to have something that looks very dynamic, you can go ahead and make sure this is still ticked on. And if you want to have something that looks a bit more static looking, where you have more control over it, just go ahead and untick it. Usually I think it looks good to have it ticked on. Now I'm just going to untick the color symmetry because I do want to go from red to yellow. And now what I want to do is I want to make a separate effect going upwards, just like the demo that I showed you at the beginning. So to do that, I'm just simply going to click my line spectrum layer, going to click Ctrl D or Command D if you're on Mac to duplicate it. Then with the new layer selected, I'm going to click P on my keyboard to get position. And then I'm going to change the numbers here to just sort of move it up a little bit so we have a little bit of spacing between them. Then inside the effects of this new one, I'm going to go down and instead of side B, I'm going to select side A. And now I'm going to show you something really cool because inside the display options, we can change how we want the spectrum to look like. So right now we have these vertical bars, but we can also change it into maybe analog lines. If we were to play this one, you can see we get a total new different effect going, but we can also choose something called analog dots, which is going to look something like this. And if you wanted to, you can always go back to the previous example where we did the circle spectrum and click it. Just scroll down and change it from digital to analog dots. And as you can see, we now have dots going instead. But in this example here, I just think it's better to have the lines going. Now, the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to add in the timer for this one, but we're going to do it in a slightly different way than the previous example, because in the previous example, we used a mask in order to change how the circle was changing shape depending on the duration of the song. In this one, instead of using a mask, I want to use a shape layer. And it's just to kind of give you some different options, because if we don't like using a mask, then we can use a shape layer instead if that's something you're more comfortable with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right click, say new, shape layer. I'm going to call this one timer. So I'm going to rename it timer. And I also want to make sure that it has a yellow tag just to make sure it matches the current example. And then I want to go up to my pen tool and I want to draw a straight line. So I'm going to click, hold down Shift, click. And if we were to zoom in so we can see a little bit better, you can see that we now have a straight line going. I can change how I want the line to look up here at the top. I can give it some stroke that has a certain color. I can change how thick the stroke should be. So I'm just going to go ahead and make it around, let's say around 6, I think is good. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the shape layer. Inside of here, you can see we have something called contents, which basically just contains all the different shapes we have inside the shape layer. But I'm not going to change the shape itself. I'm going to change the entire layer, which means that right outside where we have contents, you can see we have a add option. I'm going to click it. I'm going to choose the one called trim paths. That is going to add in a trim path option. I'm going to click the drop down, and then I want to make sure that my timeline is at the very beginning. Then I'm going to make sure we have a timestamp set for the end. And I'm going to make sure it says 0. Then I'm going to go all the way till the end of my song, hold down Shift so we have it sort of click into the last frame. And then I'm going to change the end to 100. And now we also have a moving line for this particular example. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it sort of gave you an idea of how you can change this to your own liking. So if you have a separate project that might want to have a different looking waveform, then you should be able to change it by yourself after watching this video here. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.